My name is Omer Bartov. I'm a professor of history at Brown University. I hold the chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown. I've been working as a historian for many years. I wrote my PhD in the early 1980s, so I've been writing, teaching for many years. I began as a historian studying the crimes of the German army in World War II. I wrote my dissertation on that and my first two books. And what I was interested in was the myth that was then still very common in Germany in the 1980s, 40 years after the end of World War II, that the German army fought a clean war, a professional war, but the terrible crimes occurred behind the back of the fighting soldiers. And I became skeptical of that because the German army managed to kill up to 30 million Soviet citizens during 4 years of fighting in the Soviet Union. And I couldn't believe that only the bad guys, the Gestapo and the SS, could have done that. And so I spent several years studying the German army. I studied several German army divisions, people who were at the sharp end of the war, and discovered, not to my surprise, that first of all, these young men had been heavily indoctrinated in school because they grew up already in Nazi Germany, then in the army itself, and that when they went to the Soviet Union, their heads were filled with all kinds of ideas about the people that they were fighting. They thought of them as subhuman, and they thought of them as being controlled by the Jews. They believed they were fighting Judeo-Bolshevism. And so that much of their motivation had to do with the fact that they believed that they were saving Western civilization in fighting the Red Army and the Soviet people. And as a result of that, they fought a very hard war, a very brutal, very costly war, but they somehow believed that they were fighting a good war, and that it took decades thereafter to uncover what actually the German military had done. So this was my early career, the first 10 years or so. I then became increasingly interested in the connection between total war and genocide. Because obviously in World War II, Nazi Germany was involved in genocide. But I was interested in how that connected to World War I, which was the first industrial war, and a war in which millions of soldiers died. And I thought of that as a case of industrial killing, of a war in which people, human beings, were seen not as humans, but as what the Germans called Menschenmaterial, as human material, as how many people do I have to throw to the front, and do I have enough people or more people than the enemy so that ultimately we'll bleed them white before they do that to us. And to me, that cast of mind of the First World War had implications for what happened in World War II, where instead of only killing large numbers of soldiers, Nazi Germany in particular developed a system of killing large numbers of civilians, in that case of Jews, and created an entire industrial complex that was geared not to produce cars or washing machines, but to produce bodies, to kill people in an industrial manner. And so I worked on that for quite a while and saw the various connections between war and genocide, which I believe are very important to understand if you are to understand where genocide comes from, at least in the modern era. But over time, I became a bit unhappy with the notion of looking only at these events from the top. And I wanted to understand what happens in genocide when the killers, the perpetrators, actually encounter the victims. Because when you talk about industrial murder, you're talking about what the Nazis wanted to create, and to some extent they succeeded in doing that that no one is directly responsible. People are taken from one place to another, they're put on trains, they are taken off the trains, but each part of that is compartmentalized. No one is responsible for the whole process. It is an modern industrial process in that sense. But in much of the Holocaust, in much of the genocide carried out by the Germans, people were not killed that way. They were killed where they lived. And so I thought, maybe I should look at what happens on the ground. And I chose one town in Eastern Europe, because that was where most of the Jews lived before the Holocaust, and that's where most of them were murdered. And I chose a town that happened to have been my mother's hometown, the town where my mother was born and lived until she was 11 years old, when she and her family went to Palestine in the mid-1930s. And I wanted to see what happens there. What happened when the Germans came to that town? And when I began studying that, I realized that my question as to the encounter between the killers and the victims was incomplete. Because that town was not only a Jewish town, it was a town like hundreds of other towns in Eastern Europe that had a mixed population. In that town, there were Jews, there were Ukrainians, and there were Poles. And the relations between these three groups, long before the Germans came there, had to do with how that particular genocide occurred once the Germans did arrive. That is, the Germans actually made use of the relations between the three groups to make it easier for them to carry out what they saw as their task, which was to kill the Jews. And what I discovered was that three groups that had lived side by side for 400 years, since the 16th century, and not necessarily harmoniously, but knew only that reality, over time, especially since the late 19th century and the rise of nationalism, started resenting each other, started thinking that one of them belonged and the other did not. And when the Germans came there, they used those resentments, those hatreds, those petty jealousies in order to mobilize the population to help them achieve their goal. And so they used the majority Ukrainian population in that area to mobilize it to help them in killing the Jewish population. And then Ukrainian nationalists, on their own initiative, also ethnically cleansed all the Polish population from that area. That area used to be called Eastern Galicia. It was once in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was then in Poland. And after World War II, it was and remains in Ukraine, now independent Ukraine. But it's purely Ukrainian and has very little memory of the population that lived there before the war, how they lived, and then how they were killed. And so I spent about 20 years studying that. And as I studied it, I became interested in one question. And that was that coming to that region, I could see children, youth, wandering around, herding goats, cattle, in what were the remains of Jewish civilization there. There were abandoned cemeteries, there were synagogues, there were just empty shells. And I asked myself, what did these Ukrainian kids know about? What did they understand? Did they have any language to talk about it? And obviously, they didn't, because no one told them about their past. It wasn't taught in school. It was just something that remained there. And as I was seeing that, I started thinking about my own childhood, because I was born and raised in Israel. I lived there for the first half of my life. And I grew up in the 1950s, 1960s, in Tel Aviv. Around us at the time, there were the remnants of Palestinian villages. Nobody talked about it. We used to play cops and robbers in those derelict houses. Later on, they were covered up. New neighborhoods were built over them. Tel Aviv University is built over what had been once a large Palestinian village. And I thought, how did that happen? How come we never knew about it? Or rather, we knew something, but we had no language to speak about it. And that made me think about my own origins and the origins of Israel and the origins of Zionism. And as I was studying that, things became increasingly violent in the region that I come from. October 7th happened. What we are seeing now in Gaza is still unfolding. And I wrote a book about that. I wrote a book that tries to understand how Zionism, a movement that began as a result of that rise of nationalism that I talked about, of exclusive nationalism, that the Jews had no space in Europe, that everyone said to them, you have to go elsewhere, go where you belong, you don't belong here. So a movement that was a movement of liberation, of emancipation, of appeal to humanitarianism. Once that movement began to accomplish its goals, to settle in the land of Israel, in Eretz Israel, in what was then Palestine, it too became ethno-nationalist, became exclusive, became increasingly violent, and now is engaged as a state ideology in carrying out genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza.